Binge watch and learn on TRS Clips. Let's talk about what's needed now with a bit of a recap of what's happened in the last 9 years from the perspective of economic reforms. For again, people who are just learning about econ from this particular podcast, what would you like to highlight about the last 9 years?
So, as I said, when we started out in 1990s, what were we trying to do? We basically had a license permit, government-controlled, public sector-driven economy till 1991. We opened this up, and at that stage, liberalization, i.e. opening up, is synonymous with reform and creates a period of growth. Yeah? That period of growth comes to sort of plays itself out, and then the growth can no longer go on. So for the government of that time then tries to force growth by getting the banks to lend and do other things. But it's not, there's no extra space. So you essentially, much of this lending goes waste. By 2013, 2014, the banks are going bad, seeing many of these loans go bad, and the momentum of growth is gone off. So then you need a new round of growth, but that requires doing new things. So new effort. First of all, stabilize the macroeconomy. Create an inflation targeting system, which I mentioned earlier. You create a common market so GST. You create a system of creative destruction so that old companies that have not succeeded and they can be weeded out through bankruptcy. So you have an insolvency and bankruptcy code. And so these are the reforms that happen. Then there are still some sectors that were still controlled. So open them up. Like drones, geospatial sector, etc. Then you still have companies that you had inherited, public sector companies. Then you privatize them like Air India or list LIC. So those are the kinds of things that so that has then created a new momentum of growth. And of course, along the way, you had to manage random shocks that hit your economy. So the 2 years of COVID, that's not a plan that we had, but you still have to manage it. Right? It turns up, then, big shock, you have to shut down and lock down an economy, not fun thing to do. And so you'd have to go through that. But because we invested in all these reforms, we invested in cleaning up the banks. So therefore, we had the resources in the momentum in the economy that meant that when we came out of this, we were in a position to maintain growth. And as we were discussing earlier, we have this 6.5% to 7% GDP growth that we are now doing. And given the global situation, that's very good. It's the fastest growing major economy in the world and is being done with a reasonably macro economy being a reasonably stable situation. Our foreign exchange reserves are over 600 billion. Trade account is in decent shape. Inflation, although we have this vegetable problem right now, but generally there's no long-term momentum in inflation. So that's where we are at.
You were mentioning something about the bureaucracy and the judicial systems.
Yes.
You want to expand on those thoughts?
Yes. So I described what we did over the last 30 years. Liberalized it, then created these frameworks for allowing this economy to grow. We need to do a new round of reforms over the next 20 odd years. Now, some of them we are already beginning to do. So those things are called process reforms. Process reforms is basically going sector by sector and finding out the things that you need to smoothen out there. So you've got a patent system that's not big enough. Improve our patenting system. Improve the process. We have, all these onerous criminalized rules for weights, measures, labeling. Ask anybody who tries to manufacture, say, for example, food-related products. They have to labels. There are all kinds of convoluted rules for this and very often criminalized. So we need to simplify them and decriminalize them. So these are all process reforms. So that is all something we are already underway.
Like you have to go into the details of different industries, figure out what the specific problems are with subject experts.
Yes. And then solve those. It's somewhere one nut has to be tightened, somewhere it has to be loosened.
You'll basically be improving the efficiency of those businesses and therefore collectively the economy of the country will boom.
Yes. So these are called process reforms.
Okay.
And so we need to do a whole bunch of them because they are there everywhere.
Gotcha.
And they are not cool structural reforms like the earlier reforms where you do one big thing as in the headlines. Very often they're mostly boring things. But somebody has to go and do them. So that is one lot of things that needs to be done. Then we need to do something about our judicial system. We have 50 million cases stuck in our judiciary.
Tariq pe tariq.
Absolutely. This tariq pe tariq thing has to be solved for. And there's a long discussion on this. I'm not the first person or only person who's talking about it. But we need to have a judiciary that is able to deal with this. Now, what needs to be done is not only for the government to do, that the judiciary has to really take this seriously. But they have to solve this. Because without enforcement of contract or delivery of justice on time, we can't really make progress. So this is becoming a major constraint. I would say the single biggest constraint to our economic growth.
Single biggest constraint to economic growth.
Absolutely. Because a market-based economy is based on contracts. If your entire economy is based on private sector, it's basically because everybody has contracts with everybody else. Right? You have a contract with you to buy something, a contract with you to sell something. Now, somebody has to enforce those contracts. How will the whole system function? Who enforces the contract? The judiciary does. But if the judiciary has, your case is going to come up for hearing in 3 years' time, then how can I run my business?
Can we learn from another country who's fixed that judiciary?
Absolutely. There are several of them. This is not a new problem. The country that I like to mention is a very small country called Singapore. But it too had a serious judicial problem. And then at some point in time, they cleaned it up and they got it to function. It's now one of the best judiciaries in the world.
How do you possibly clean it up?
Well, first of all, you've got to modernize the processes. We have archaic medieval processes which need to be smoothened out. We need to have, this system of appeal, for example. You get a judgment in your favor, but you can go and appeal to it forever till everything ends up in the Supreme Court. We've got to stop that. The government itself needs to stop appealing rulings every time something comes against it, including when the ruling is done by its own tribunals, for example, in income tax. So we need to have a system where there is a system of enforcement of rules, regulations, and laws and contracts that functions. And today, this is now the single biggest constraint to the functioning of our economy.
So effectively, when you boil it down to the root of this problem, it's some people who are in charge of the judiciary who can actually change this, right?
Well, the government also has to be a part of it because they will have to provide more, invest in money, provide the resources. Because a lot of this, for example, you can apply artificial intelligence to simplify the process. You can make the processes much simpler. Government has a role in all of this. Okay. It's not just the judiciary itself. So it has to be done in partnership and it has to be taken seriously.
So TRS Clips has all sorts of videos and all sorts of playlists. Make sure you explore the channel by subscribing and heading to our homepage and reading through all the playlists. Happens through curiosity.